Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. Welcome from where I am on unceded Algonquin territory in Ottawa, Canada. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University, and I have the real privilege of being the project director for LERRN, which is the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. LERRN is a partnership between researchers, civil society partners, and refugee leaders in Canada and other parts of the world, but especially focused on the needs and opportunities identified by our working groups in East Africa and the Middle East. Through research, training, capacity building, policy engagement, and public dialogue, we're working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the global refugee regime, especially in pursuit of protection and solutions with and for refugees. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I reside and on which Carleton University is located is the traditional and unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I say this not just out of protocol, but out of respect and out of recognition of the fact that the questions of dislocation and dispossession that we discuss today are also part of the history of this territory. And I think that acknowledgement is particularly fitting as we discuss today's topic on what counts as knowledge. It's an important lesson that's part of the conversation on reconciliation here in this territory. Let me begin by saying then how delighted I am to welcome more than 60 participants. We have over 180 registrants for this webinar. I know that others will be joining as connections allow. Attendees for this first webinar in the LERRN-RRN webinar series on ethics in forced migration research. The goal of this series as a whole, and the conversation that we're starting in the webinar today, is to contribute to a growing conversation in the field of refugee and forced migration studies on the need to do research differently. This is a call that's been building since Chimney's critique of the geopolitics of refugee studies in 1998 and the work of the Refugee Research Network under Susan McGrath's leadership, and growing calls to address the power asymmetries that have conditioned research on forced migration. I think in particular of the recent section of the Journal of Refugee Studies and the introduction on the role of power in research methodologies. Our discussions in this series, I'd like to note, builds from the work of many, many others, including those behind the 2019 IASFM Code of Ethics. What we hope to do in this series is to take a deeper look at the various stages of the research process and benefiting from a range of perspectives, of diverse perspectives. It's through this series that we hope to contribute to building a community of practice dedicated to supporting ethical and relevant research on forced migration. We hope to share best practices on designing and conducting research and offering practical guidance to researchers who are designing research projects, along with members of diverse communities who engage with those projects. It's a really profound privilege and honor to be co-hosting this series with the Refugee Research Network, a group from which I have learned a great deal over the past 14 years. So let me welcome Susan McGrath, Professor Emerita at York University and Director of the RRN, to offer her reflections. Susan, over to you, please.
Good morning, and thank you, James, and good day to all of you joining us from wherever you are. The Refugee Research Network is really pleased to join with LERRN in this webinar series on ethics in forced migration research. And special thanks to Rachel McNally and the LERRN team for all their work and effort in organizing and bringing us these presentations to today and the rest of the series. I think our first webinar provides a great foundation to the series with this exploration of the types of knowledge that are included in our research and that are not. And so I'm pleased to welcome our three excellent speakers, Elena, Foni, Yusuf, who will help us consider the voices and the perspectives that need to be heard. I'm looking forward to this discussion. Back to you, James.
Thank you much, Susan. Thanks for being with us, and my thanks to everyone in the RRN team for your contributions to the conversation that has brought this series into being. It's going to be a fascinating series of webinars that we host together. We invite you to join us in the conversation on social media. Please tag Learning Refugee Research and the hashtag Whose Voice to contribute to this conversation on Twitter. So we hope you enjoy this webinar, and we really thank you for joining and spending more time in front of your screen. So on to today's webinar. Today's webinar asks the question, what counts as knowledge in forced migration research, and whose voices and perspectives frame research? What we have seen is a conversation in the literature about the various forms that knowledge takes, but what's privileged as the most legitimate or authoritative forms of research? The gold standard in knowledge promoted by Western academia remains peer-reviewed journal articles in frequently cited journals and monographs in university presses. But this form of knowledge is not accessible to many people and communities. And increasingly, we recognize and understand that it misses other forms of knowledge, like oral or artistic traditions, or knowledge in local languages, or knowledge that's produced in other ways that can have an influence on addressing the phenomenon that's at the center of our pursuit of knowledge in refugee and forced migration studies. So to start this series, and before we get into questions of partnerships and research design and conducting research, we thought it was really important to foreground the entire series in a discussion of what counts as knowledge, whose voices or perspectives matter, what forms of knowledge do various partners recognize as useful or influential in their sectors? What does successful research look like? How do different forms of knowledge speak to different goals and different contexts? So we are profoundly fortunate to have an exceptional group of speakers that are going to help guide us through a conversation on these questions. I feel particularly privileged to have Elena, Yusuf, and Foni. They're three speakers that I really enjoy listening to, and so I feel particularly spoiled that I get to moderate this conversation. We're joined by Elena Fiddian-Qasmiyeh as professor in migration and refugee studies at University College London, where she's also director of the Refuge in a Moving World Research Network, co-director of the UCL's Migration Research Unit, and principal investigator of the Refugee Host and the Southern Responses to Displacement projects. Elena wears many hats and wears them all extremely well. Her leadership through these projects has really challenged our understanding of the sources and forms of knowledge that speak to dynamics and experiences of displacement. I've learned a lot from Elena, and I'm delighted that she's with us for this webinar today. We're also joined by Foni Joyce Vuni, who is the coordinator of the Global Refugee Youth Network and a research associate at the Refugee-led Research Hub in Nairobi, Kenya. That's a collaborative initiative between the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford and the British Institute in East Africa. Later today, there'll be a public seminar from the Refugee Studies Center where some other researchers from that hub will be presenting work on refugee-led organizations in East Africa. Foni's incredible leadership over the years has challenged assumptions about the sources of knowledge on displacement issues and the various forms that knowledge can take. For an example of this, look no further than Foni's Letter to My Future Self that was presented at this year's UNHCR Executive Committee meeting. Foni has really educated me in the various forms that knowledge can take and the various ways that we can understand impact of knowledge. I've also learned quite a bit from Fiddian-Qasmiyeh, who is a poet, a DPhil candidate in English literature at St. Anne's College, Oxford, and the writer in residence with the Refugee Host Project. He's the creative encounters editor at the journal Migration and Society, and his collection, Writing the Camp, the link is there, published by Broken Sleep Books in 2021, was the Poetry Book Society's recommendation for spring 2021. This work and Yusuf's poetry has made a very significant contribution to broadening our understanding of the critical forms in which knowledge is manifest. And I think we need to look no further than Yusuf's impact in his readings at the ISFM conference this past summer in really presenting a very compelling yet subtle argument that if we exclude artistic representation, such as in the form of poetry, that we miss a very critical piece in understanding the displacement of phenomenon, the experience of displacement as well. So welcome, Elena, welcome, Foni, welcome, Yusuf. I want to begin by asking you all a similar question. I'd like to know, from your experience, why is this topic important? Why is it important for us to have a conversation on this question of what counts as knowledge? And Yusuf, if I may, I'd like to begin with you. So Yusuf, why is this topic and this conversation about what counts as knowledge, why is it important to you? Over to you, Yusuf. Welcome.
Thank you, James, and thanks to all of you for having me and for having us as well. I'm going to start by reading a poem from my collection, Writing the Camp, and the title of this poem is Anthropologists. But what's really, perhaps before I read this poem, is perhaps to shed light on the way this piece is segmented and how it comprises two parts. And it's bridged, in fact, by void, total whiteness, total blankness. Anthropologists. I know some of them are friends, but the majority are enemies. Upon the doorstep, you observe what they observe with a lot of care. You look at them the way they look at you, curiously and obliquely. You suddenly develop a fear of imitating them whilst they imitate you. You worry about relapsing into one of your minds while sharing mundane details with them. Sometimes I dream of devouring all of them, and just once, with no witnesses or written testimonies. All of us wanted to greet her, even my illiterate mother, who never spoke a word of English, said welcome. After spending hours with us in the same room, she left with a jar of homemade pickles and the 3 full cassettes with our voices. I think that your question, James, takes us back to what constitutes knowledge and how knowledge itself is also produced in these refugee camps. And here I'm referring to my home camp, Badawi camp, and how at times, and perhaps most of the times, we feature as equitable materials, but not as co-producers of this knowledge, the knowledge that is transformed into articles, and the knowledge that is transformed also into presentations, and it travels across time and space. And yet we feature on the margins. And what happens here is perhaps to return to the question of voice and what comprises the voice itself. And I've written, I think Elena and myself have co-written a piece on how to embroider the voice with its own needle, that we do not offer people voices. These voices belong to these individuals, whether refugees or citizens, and they are in fact in charge of their knowledge. So the co-production of knowledge is in fact not just a decorative, perhaps, heading, but also an act in its own right that invites us all to view knowledge critically and also to view the directionality of knowledge in the process.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. I think that notion of, from quotable subjects to co-producers, and it's not just I think what I really take away from that in the very powerful poem, that it's not just what constitutes knowledge, but what's the agency of the carriers of that knowledge, which I think is a very important place to foreground our conversation. So thank you. Elena, let me turn to you with that same question from your experience and bridging from the way that that the Refugees Hosts project has really sort of challenged us to think beyond these very Western academic forms of knowledge. I know the role that you played in promoting this question within the migration leadership team's work. You've had a significant impact on this conversation. Let me now turn to you from your perspective. Why is this topic and this conversation important to you?
Thanks, James, and thanks to all of you for organising this event and the series, which is a really important one. I think from my perspective, it's important to situate this conversation within that broader history, the long-standing debates, in fact, which have existed across different fields with reference to the Eurocentric nature of knowledge production and the centralisation of particular people and particular institutions as producers of bona fide knowledge, and the restrictions and the barriers which have been positioned around certain producers of knowledge as bastions, effectively, which reproduce themselves, as it were. But I'd start by just situating this not only with reference to refugee studies, but also the different fields that refugee studies does, but also sometimes doesn't engage with more explicitly. So, for example, within feminist and queer studies, there's a long history of challenging particular forms of knowledge production, particular ways of writing, particular ways of centralizing agency, and of requiring people to perform particular roles in that process. So even if we think about the mantra that we hear often, nothing about us without us, which has taken hold in UNHCR, for example, this has a longer history within a range of fields, from critical disability studies to homelessness studies, for example. So there are many different fields in which this requirement of not just listening, but actually meaningfully engaging with people who are not simply there to be described, but who are always responding to their own situations, always navigating and creating new forms of response. We need to identify the continuation of these debates and the extent to which sometimes these debates have been taking place in parallel and haven't been picked up on in refugee studies and in other areas of research as well. So we can obviously also tie this to what would contemporarily be known as decolonial approaches. But again, we can bring back to the question that Yusuf is raising with reference to the position of the arts. So if we think of somebody like Gloria Anzaldúa, the queer Chicana poet and scholar, who has written extensively in different fora and through different linguistic media about questions of borderlands, of displacement, of dispossession, in ways that has then been appropriated and used by other theorists and taken as theory, rather than recognizing her as a producer of knowledge and a theorist in her own right. So taking those cassettes of voices, taking those books as inspiration and as metaphors, rather than acknowledging her as a theorist in her own right. So again, that's that broader history. So within my own research, within refugee hosts, for example, we've attempted to really challenge and disrupt a number of mainstream humanitarian narratives, but also some what have come to be mainstream approaches in a lot of research in this field. So firstly, we've done that by working with Yusuf as the writer in residence for the Refugee Hosts Research Project, as someone who was born and raised in one of what we would call our field sites, but it's obviously it's the place where the people that we work with live. And I'll just read a couple of lines from Yusuf's poem Writing the Camp, which I think encapsulates what our research project has been doing with great clarity, and probably he will not be happy with me saying this, but probably more eloquently than I could write in an article, for example. So I will read his lines here. Refugees ask other refugees, who are we to come to you, and who are you to come to us? Nobody answers. Palestinians, Syrians, Iraqis, Kurds share the camp, the same different camp, the camp of a camp. They have all come to re-originate the beginning with their own hands and feet. Now, I think this poem, those lines from this poem really capture the question of what is the refugee encounter? Who is encountering who, and who is the we when we think about research? Is it we as outsiders, as citizens, as researchers? What happens if we actually start from the assumption that the we are members of the displaced communities themselves, who are encountering one another, asking questions of one another, and responding to one another's presence, and in fact re-originating the beginning with their own hands and feet? So we've worked with Yusuf. We've also obviously worked with locally based researchers who themselves have displacement backgrounds, whether personal or familial, and we've attempted to do so in ways which challenge some structural inequalities which have typically characterized research projects, but which also haven't reproduced a tendency to patronize people and to assume that we know what is best and what other people want. So at the beginning of the project, for example, I naively assumed that the locally based researchers with whom we would be working would be interested in co-authoring articles. Well, actually, not all of our colleagues have wanted to co-author articles. Some have wanted to write poetry in response to their research. Some have been quite happy being paid for the interviews that they've conducted and have not wanted to partake in co-authorship projects, which we had assumed might be of interest to them. So I think that my interest in this question is, in fact, how we can challenge those structural inequalities, the inequalities of knowledge production and of identifying different modes of working together and working with different people, but also without fetishizing the refugee and without requiring people to adopt the roles that we might expect of them. It's to accept that somebody might, in fact, have no interest at all in research and might have no interest at all in either being an interlocutor or a research interviewee, or in fact, writing or writing back, whilst others will indeed challenge ethnographers, challenge people who are writing about them through different means, whether it's through refusing to be interviewed, through writing poetry, through graffiti, through speaking in different ways. So there are just some quick thoughts and reflections on why these questions I think are of interest to me, but putting really structural inequalities at the core and ensuring that whatever we do is with different members of different communities in their own right, as it were, rather than assuming and fetishizing people.
Yeah, no, thank you, Elena. I think that's such a helpful intervention, and there are a couple of key points that I really want to underscore. One is the point that you make that, while this is a conversation that has been percolating within refugee and forced migration studies, thanks to the leadership of many of you on the call, this is a conversation that has been thriving in other fields. Likewise with conversations about so-called the localization of research. When we look at areas from ecology to fine arts to law and legal studies, there's so many fields that are embarked on these existential questions, these very fundamental questions about the role and the purpose and the functioning of knowledge. I think we have quite a bit to learn and to be able to bring these conversations together. But it does lead to these questions about these structural inequalities, not only in the production of knowledge, but the use of knowledge, the privileging of knowledge, which is a question that we'll be asking throughout this webinar series. But it really reminds me of that early call when Chimney published the Geopolitics of Refugee Studies in 1998. We remember that moment where it was sort of this voice in the desert crying, repent, where Chimney was calling out how, the policy, as research is driven by the policy paradigms of donor states within the global north, it produces certain unintended or unconscious biases and intentionalities in the conduct of research and the questions that are posed and what's privileged as knowledge. And so I think as much as I feel encouraged in where we've come in the conversation, it's a strong reminder on still how far it is that we really have to go. But on the point that you make about the power of knowledge and what forms of knowledge have the greatest power, I think to imagine that those who hold power in situations of displacement are going to read 8,000-word journal articles or 200-page monographs is we realize that the knowledge that's produced in relation to certain constructed realities that we face within academia. And Phony, it's on that point that I really want to turn to you, because the way that you have used knowledge to influence conversations, not only around youth participation, refugee participation, in very subtle ways. And there's a line in your letter to your future self where you say, it's right at the end of the video where you say, hold them accountable. And the way that you have used knowledge in your own work as a way not to advance academic debates, but in addition to contributing to academic debates, but very much the practical use of knowledge in the everyday politics of displacement and on that question of accountability and the work that you've been doing recently with the refugee-led research hub. So Phony, you bring many important perspectives to this conversation. So let me turn it to you to ask, from your experience, why is this topic and this conversation important to you? Over to you, Phony.
Thank you very much, James. I do agree with the sentiments that Elena and Yusuf have made. I totally agree with them 100%. I think for me, why this is particularly important is because having lived in displacement for 27 years and counting, this has meant that I have been referred to as labels, I have been referred to as subjects, and I've also been referred to as a statistics, right? And I'm not discounting what the knowledge that is out there, the knowledge that has been put out there, but then one of the important questions that when I was thinking about this series itself, I kept on asking myself was, what actually even informs the form of knowledge that people decide to use? And this goes back to the different opinions or the different goals, the different policymakers, states, and other stakeholders would want out of this particular academic study. And I think for me, having lived that long period in displacement, I've learned that as much as there are various forms of knowledge, there are various forms of evidence, the accountability aspect is really important. And this is because I'm based in my community. I interact with the community 24/7. And when you interact with the community, you get to see you see things happening as the days go by. You look at the experiences of the people in the community, you look at the diversity aspect that is also within the community, and you also look at the inclusion aspect that is within the community. And for me, why this particular topic on knowledge and what counts as knowledge is really important is because when I think about my community and the way we are interacting and the way we're doing things, two things come to my mind. The first one is that despite the different knowledge or the forms of knowledge that is out there, one thing that has remained consistent is that within the refugee community, there's also different forms of knowledge. There are different forms of knowledge that sometimes are not taken into consideration. And this might end up affecting the results we end up putting out, or we might also end up missing a particular group of people because we're focusing on only a particular set of research or a particular set of knowledge. So these at the end might end up coming back to the community as a fact that where you find within the community, we might feel whatever academic work is going on or whatever research is happening, it doesn't relate to our reality because we feel this is something that has been overused. This is something that has been overstretched. And I think with the work that we're doing within the Hub, one of the things that we have made sure to really be intentional about is that when we're looking at how we even engage with refugee researchers, one of the things that we're quite keen on is letting them decide what sort of way do you want to proceed with this particular research? Because at the end of the day, they do have the expertise, they do have the experience, they have the first-hand experience, and to hold people accountable, they will use these particular experiences to hold the different people accountable. So for me, why this is important, it's important because it creates, this conversation really creates a basis of holding people accountable. It's one thing to say, we will do this, we will incorporate ethical consideration, we'll do this, but then if we're not really holding people accountable through continuous engagement, that becomes a big problem. And then the other aspect is of giving away power. I think, just as I've mentioned, when we're thinking about the forms of knowledge, this is always also highly influenced by the objective of the particular study that people might want to take, or the different interests that people might have. And once that is taken into consideration, giving away power becomes quite hard because you have objectives you have to meet, you have deadlines or deliverables you have to meet, and then interacting with the community, the refugee community, becomes quite hard. So I think for me, also the conversation around giving away, the aspects on giving away power is really important as we continue work with this particular session.
No, and I think the way that you frame that within questions of power, within questions of accountability, but also in terms of questions of legitimacy, in the way that you say, Foni, that that communities that participate in research, when they then see the outcomes of that research and they don't see themselves as having participated in either the process or the product, it really brings into the question the legitimacy of the knowledge that's contained within that form, within that artifact as the academic output. I'm reminded of David Turton's comments, and I'll nuance it, I'll paraphrase it somewhat because of the connotation of suffering. But in 1996, David Turton said, that research into, in his words, research into human suffering, but let's paraphrase it and to say that, research into, human dispossession is only justifiable if one of the objectives of that work is in some way to engage with, to ameliorate, or to challenge that dispossession. So I think it raises this not just as a conceptual question, but a very principled question of legitimacy, especially when we consider the significant growth in the volume of research funding and research product that we've seen within the field of refugee and forced migration studies, certainly since 2015. So, the question as Elena phrased it in terms of structural inequalities, but very much, the political economy of research, what Catherine Brun and Maha Shoyab in their recent piece talks about the refugee research complex, this notion of a set of vested interests that produce social realities as a result of economic interests and drivers. So, I think that bridges very much into this question. And Elena, I'm going to start with you in as we move on to this question of really what forms of knowledge are currently privileged, right? When we really think about forms of knowledge, let's say, what are the forms of knowledge that you see as currently privileged? And by privileging those forms of knowledge, what's left out, right? What are we missing with the status quo? What is it that we are overlooking, or what's being effaced or silenced or drowned out by what is currently being produced? So Elena, I'd like to start with you, but Foni, I then would like to come back to you after Elena for your perspective on that, and then Yusuf will come to you. So Elena, what forms of knowledge are currently privileged, and at what cost? Elena?
Thanks, James. I think we can approach this question from different perspectives. So we could start with acknowledging the coloniality of knowledge. And that takes us both to different forms of communication, but also the figure of the expert and how the figure of the outside, typically white, often male researcher, is seen as being at the apex of the holder and producer of knowledge, which is reliable and serious knowledge. And precisely by not being a member of the community, this is perceived to be very serious knowledge, which can in fact influence policy and practice, versus types of knowledge which might be accepted but used as seasoning on otherwise serious research. So this is where we see, for example, increasing numbers of research projects using creative writing or photography alongside, for example, quantitative research methods and or survey data, and acknowledging that people are photographers, for example, or poets, etc., but using these inputs as forms of seasoning to an otherwise still very mainstream approach to knowledge presentation. So we could start with that position of coloniality, which is deeply embedded in structural inequalities linked with racialization and the marginalization of different people. And as the counterpoint to that, the acknowledgement of so-called local forms of knowledge, or even refugee-led knowledge, which again can lead to what I've suggested earlier, can be a process of fetishization. It can be a mode of instrumentalizing certain people rather than actually acknowledging an equality and the plurality of different forms of knowledge, which should be meaningfully engaged with and acknowledged as such. So I'll come back. I'm sure that we'll come back to the notion of voice in a moment. But again, I'll just remind us that these are not new debates. That if we go back to Black feminist scholars, for example, and writers, we have people as important as Bell Hooks in the 1980s arguing, I quote, "Certainly for Black women, our struggle has not been to emerge from silence into speech, but to change the nature and direction of our speech, to make a speech that compels listeners, one that is heard. The voices of Black women could be tuned out, could become a kind of background music, audible but not acknowledged as significant speech." So I think that if we're attentive to who is being positioned as being capable of producing what Bell Hooks calls significant speech, including across intersecting vectors of gender, race, sexuality, migration status, refugee status, etc., but also what kinds of knowledge are viewed as significant in their own right. What is knowledge versus seasoning? What is knowledge versus a quotable instant, etc. So we could approach it from those perspectives, or we could start from the kind of the premise that you also started with, James, which is that books and journal articles are seen as being more rigorous and more serious, especially when published by particular bearers of institutional power, versus, for example, a blog, which might be seen as informal because it hasn't been through peer review, or poetry as knowledge in and of itself, not just something that is there to be analysed either by a literary scholar or by social scientists who are suddenly interested in quoting Yusuf's lines, for example, in their mainstream social science article. So I'll stop speaking there, but I think that a great deal is left out when we privilege particular people, particular institutions, and particular scripts in these processes.
And I think it goes to that fundamental question again of power, the notion of, knowledge as seasoning as opposed to the power to be able to influence, from the very beginning, not only of what the research question, the research agenda, but, diverging, end objectives. In a moment, I'll share the analogy that when the American University in Beirut launched a campaign about public consciousness around refugee issues in the context of cyclical crisis in Lebanon, for them, the knowledge, the forms of knowledge that was going to have the greatest impact were infographics and tweets, really well constructed visuals. And colleagues involved in that campaign, Elena, Yusuf, many of them you may know, say this is not going to advance my academic career, because there's nowhere in my end of year reporting that I can say how many tweets or how many infographics I've produced. But they said I'd be missing the point. I'd be completely missing the plot of my sense of responsibility as an academic, if I was conditioned and motivated by career advancement, as opposed to the role that academic research can play in bringing about social change. And Phony, I want to use that as a way of coming to the point that you raised about accountability and legitimacy and questions of power. From your perspective, you've talked about your 27-year experience of having been a statistic, having been a subject, but in the way that you are now contributing through the East Africa Hub and other initiatives to try and challenge that power, what do you see as the forms of knowledge that have been privileged? And what do we miss out on when we privilege those forms of knowledge?
Definitely. To start us off, I'll share an experience within the Global Refugee Youth Network. One of our coordinators, the Diversity and Gender Coordinator, is based in Chakatu, Uganda. And her work basically is on gender issues, on child marriages, and just fighting that, because she has experienced and lived through that particular process. And one of the things that she has done within her location is that she has set up a studio. She set up a studio, a Solar Hub studio. And one of the things that they have done within this particular studio, they have continuously used music as a form of educating, as a form of gathering information. They have used dance, they have used poetry, and they have been able to capture quite a lot of data, especially even within the COVID period. These were some of the things that they were using. They were using poetry, they were using music, they were using dance to share information, but at the same time to gather information and facts around what is actually happening in the community. And one of the questions that when we were preparing and working around our report, we tried to really gather all these different points that they have been working on at the local level. And then one of the questions that we were asked was, do you have a link that can verify this? Is it included in a book? Is it included in a journal? Is it included in a particular place? And I think the traditional media has been really privileged, because then it excludes all the other efforts that other people are doing in the community. Because I think these are also valuable forms of knowledge that are doing quite a lot and need to be taken into consideration. If we're talking about social media, for instance, we did have an interaction with a researcher, and one of the things that we were highlighting what the young people are doing in the community and the forms of communication they're using to kind of like share information, but as well as collect data. And when you immediately mentioned social media, it was kind of like a no, that's a no-go zone. How can we quantify this? How can we talk about this as something that is that someone can believe it's actually verifiable data? And I think this is one of the things that is really missing. It means that as people who are displaced in the community, we have to find different ways. And once we already find those ways, such as blogs, such as social media, then it becomes also quite hard, because this is not a form of knowledge or production that is acceptable. We're still stuck on the books, the journals, the scripts, or publishing articles in a particular well-known organization, then that would be considered. But then all these other forms are not acknowledged. And I think one of the things we're trying to do at the same time at the Hub is to ensure that we unlearn and relearn new things, because that's one thing that is also needed. We're talking about giving away power and also accepting the new forms of knowledge. It also means that we need to create a space whereby we have the opportunity to explore some of this particular knowledge. If someone is working on blogs, then why not publish these blogs and really create that database to ensure that anyone else who would want to refer to this would easily go into this. And then the other things that we're also doing in relation to ensure that the forms of knowledge are also included is that working with experienced researchers is also one of the things, because ensuring that that transfer of skills, learning from this is what is actually happening, this is what is acceptable, but then also opening a space to hear what are some of the other creative ideas within the community. And I think that is what is missing. If we don't look into this, then we exclude quite a lot of other sort of knowledge because we're stuck on the traditional, the acceptable norm, because we don't want to give away power. That's also, it still goes back to the power imbalances. If I do accept all these other forms of different types of knowledge, am I in a way saying that I am not going to be credited as the person who did this, or will I be able to accept it? So I think these are some of the things that is happening, and we're missing out on quite a lot, because I think within the refugee community, it's not only poetry, there's also dance. The creative pieces are coming up quite strong. And we also, if we were to say, if we had to have a more inclusive, a more triangulated sort of data, then we also have to be able to open up and be flexible to accept these other forms of knowledge channels that the community is also using currently.
No, funny, I think that's such a critical point. And you raised this question, and we'll come back to this in a moment, on the question of how the COVID moment and sort of this move online, you talked about in the context of Uganda, how, during COVID, moving into, virtual platforms sort of created a space where maybe there was not, and Elena, going to your point in your quote from Bell Hooks, it's not so much that new forms of knowledge were produced, but maybe a greater audience, a wider audience, had the ears to be able to hear these new forms of knowledge that were always there, or that by moving into a virtual existence, as we did during the pandemic, that we encountered those in a more equalizing space. And it also raises the question about whether, is it a question of either or, that it's not a question of, it's either producing the 8,000-word journal article, which has a role in very particular contexts, arguably, but if there's a genuine collaborative process of co-designing research, and if there is that willingness, as you say, Foni, to share power, to recognize that the end result will not just be an academic product that advances particular careers and agendas, but that there's a more eclectic or ecumenical understanding of what will come out of that research collaboration. We'll come to that in a moment. But Yusuf, I want to bring you back into the conversation, linking with Elena's notion of, in particular, your poetry being used to season the research, and your poem on your secret desire to devour anthropologists. I see this as, coming from an understanding that there are particular forms of knowledge that have been privileged, and as Elena and Foni have highlighted. But really, what do we miss out on if we retain this hierarchy, if we privilege these forms of academic knowledge? What do we miss out on, not only as a discipline, but as a community engaged with these pressing issues of displacement? Yusuf, what are your thoughts on that?
In fact, with regards to the question of seasoning, we have to maybe to return to who is presented as the superfluous or the flavor, to the main body, to this wholeness that is understood as wholeness by mainly the expert or the experts. In fact, I'm writing about the metaphor of mainly the refugee, the interviewee, as the cane or the stick that is leant upon. And of course, to take us from A to B and then disposed of as we reach a specific deliverable, maybe, or destination. And these are thoughts that have always perhaps troubled me as well. When I return to my home camp and I go to other refugee camps, where different now refugees coexist and live, and they share these spaces. I think that we have also to maybe to understand the human value of knowledge, especially when we inquire about the well-being of these individuals who are being interviewed and at times perhaps over-interviewed, and to make sure that they are okay, in fact, to be interviewed. And they are okay to speak all the time about the same, perhaps, thematics. And these redundancies in research, that at times you have different research projects, in fact, that are somewhat redundant. And yet, of course, we have to see whether it is in the best interest of these refugees or of these individuals to keep maybe or to continuously revisiting these very same topics, and not to inquire about the readiness as well and the willingness of those who are being interviewed, whether they would like to take part or not, whether they would like, in fact, to add something to it, and to understand that there are different fora. It's not just the interview itself, what delivers, but also it's about very, perhaps, humane questions about how they are living and whether they are sustaining themselves and whether they can talk or they have maybe the ability to speak. I think that I keep thinking about perhaps my mother here and how at times, especially when I talk about our household, our house in Badawi camp, and how often people would knock on the door and assume that we are ready to be interviewed, that our readiness, in fact, is something that belongs to them. And we are really, and we should be grateful, because towards the end of this interview, we're going to be given perhaps $5 American. And that's why the understanding that we're there to mainly give information and for this information to be repackaged. And of course, this information belongs to us, but it's repackaged. And then of course, referred to the individual who will be writing this piece. So back to how at times knowledge itself can be extractive and also annihilates and absents those behind the data and behind the statistics, and they feature as mainly numbers, as those who are giving, of course, their voice, but also this voice eventually is going to belong to the writer of this piece. I think that back to anthropologists, it's not just about being interviewed, but it's about seeing how those in these camps, in fact, are the creators of the archive, their own archive, not just the article, but also how they survive daily, how they manage their time, how they rethink also their own survival in these very difficult, treacherous conditions that they've been living in for decades.
No, that's really powerful. And your notion about, redundancy, of redundant research, but also that presumption of gratitude. I feel as though it would be disingenuous of me not to recognize my own positionality and how these conversations have been part of my relationship, especially, and I'd like to name Professor Koti Kamanga at the University of Dar es Salaam, who in 1999 met me at the airport in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and enabled me as a graduate student to conduct research. And our conversation in these, 21 years since that moment have been very much about, recognizing that support and that facilitation enabled me to produce research that enabled me to get degrees and publish a book and get a job. And so the question now is that how do I, as a white male Canadian academic with a tenured position and legal status, how do I recognize that which I have been given? And so, Yusuf, I take very much, this question of relationship and dynamic, and Phony, your question of power. I'd like to, I hope, and KK isn't on the call with us, but I'll send him an email after this webinar to say that I have evoked that story and this conversation we've been having for more than 20 years. But I would like to think that relationship is not a moment in time, Yusuf. So it's not that where we can perhaps best grapple with these questions of power and privilege and additionality and the relationship that is able to inform research that is mutually important, comes out of relationships that take time to forge and time to sustain. That it's not a knock on the door and $5 and here's a little bit of compensation, and then I leave with those 3 cassette tapes, as you phrased it. And Phony, I'd like to use that as a way of returning to you, and for everyone in the audience. In a moment, we'll be turning to the Q&A. I already have 2 questions in the Q&A that I'll be using to start that Q&A session in just a moment. But before I do, Phony, I want to come back to you with the question of, if we've talked about the forms of knowledge that are privileged and what's left out, really my question to you, and then I think Elena to you. No, I'm going to go Phony first to you, and then Yusuf, and then Elena to you. What are the forms of knowledge that you see as having had impact? You mentioned the knowledge produced in dance, for example, from Uganda, but where do you see those examples of where knowledge has had impact, and how do you define what you mean by the impact that knowledge can have, and how can those understandings or those examples really contribute to this kind of structural change? And that's why, Elena, I'm going to end with you, because you framed it within this question of structures. So how can these examples of where knowledge has impact, and our understanding of the potential of knowledge to have impact, how can that contribute to change? Phony, first to you, and then Yusuf, and then Elena, before we turn it open to questions. Phony, go ahead, please.
I think one of the things, when we look at the example that I've said with the dance, with music, with art, and how it can contribute to impact, one of the aspects that it can, and how it can contribute to impact, is that instead of focusing on a language from the global north, then we're able to also take language from the community directly. The other aspect that I think it also really helps in terms of focusing on knowledge, the forms of knowledge that are acceptable. For instance, most of them are based in the global north, but then when we come to the global south, some of them are not acceptable. And I think by focusing on the aspects that is within the locality or the global south, this will create impact, because then the global south will also be contributing and generating their knowledge and feeding into the processes that the global south is also having. So I think that is how it can contribute to impact, and how it can also contribute to these forms being acceptable. And then the other thing that I think on how it also contributes to impact is that we are working directly with people who have experience, people who have knowledge about this particular, the forced migration journey. And if we're working with them directly, then this means that the findings of our research, the results will be quite rich in terms of diversity, not engaging people as study subject, as rather looking at them as people who are equal and also contributing to the results that we hope to achieve. And how I define, when I think about how this can be achieved and how this knowledge, the different forms can also be acceptable, we need to co-create together. If we have a researcher who has been working on this particular field, and we have a refugee researcher who also has a different form of knowledge that they feel it would work for the research they're conducting, then let's co-create. Let's not shun it out because I am too experienced or I find this invalid and I would not listen. So I think it's also about creating that opportunity. It's also about acknowledging the positionality that as researcher, what privileges do you have? With the background you have, I think Professor Elena had mentioned that you'd find that sometimes the male will be, whatever they produce will be more acceptable as opposed to women. And it's also really a matter of us as seasoned researchers being able to acknowledge that we have those privileges and working through that. And for me, I think the other thing that as I think about how a successful research or something that is really impactful, I think about how we're working at the hub. How we're working at the hub is that we have displaced researchers at the hub. This is the refugee-led research hub. And then we have non-displaced researchers. So we're working together with them and they're sharing their knowledge and their expertise and they're letting us lead the process. So it's also about giving away power, but also finding the right balance and supporting in a very stable, critical way to ensure that if we're conducting a research, we also can be able to say, I think this particular methodology is better as opposed to this. I think this particular form will be much more better suited for my community as opposed to what you're saying, because we live in the community, we understand the community. And then in terms of research, successful research, first of all, it has to incorporate the voices of the affected from the ideation to the evaluation. If you're conducting a research and you sit down as a researcher and you think about the questions alone and you've not included the community, that's not a research for the community. It's your own research. It's you pushing forward your agenda. Then the other thing, the research has to make sure that it provides feedback to the community, because if we want people to also accept the different forms of knowledge that exist, we also have to ensure that we provide feedback to the community, and then the findings also have to be made sure they're available in languages that the community understands for transparency issues, to be held accountable, and to leave space for you as a researcher to also be questioned. Why did you take this as opposed to this? And I think these are some of the aspects that will really make accountability and ethics of the different research we do much more stronger and acceptable.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Foni. And Yusuf, I think that resonates with those questions of relationships and responsibility and accountability and trust. But from your point of view, Yusuf, where do you find forms of knowledge that have had a greater impact, and how can we learn from that to contribute to changing these structures? Yusuf, over to you.
I think that again, I'm going to return to the camp. In fact, I'm going to return to my mother, the way as a poet, as a translator, as a scholar. And my mother is illiterate. She can't write and she can't read. But in fact, I've written about co-writing with her. I've written about co-seeing with her, that these words, the words that she utters, are being sustained in writing or maybe in other formats. And this is something that we need to acknowledge as researchers. I think that it's not just about being grateful to the mother and to the father in that setting, but in fact to acknowledge that these voices are also contributing to what we call the individual voice. And that is why, back to knowledge, the plurality of knowledge that comprises, in fact, multiple singulars. It's not just about one, but these individual voices are there also to sustain themselves, to stay and to remain. And perhaps something else that I would like to highlight is how Elena and myself, when we were in Jordan, and that was the very first time we realized that writing workshops also exclude those who can't write. This is something that we need to remember, and how at times saying things is also a form of knowledge, but also to say it doesn't mean that these words are going to be repackaged and quoted or without even acknowledging who's behind these words. So this, again, back to sustainability, how we sustain the very source of knowledge, the person who utters, and how the traveling of this knowledge should not just feature decoratively and circumstantially, back to how we make sure that this knowledge is there to stay and to be seen and co-seen.
No, thank you. And Elena, from your perspective, and building from Yusuf's understanding, not just of sort of impact in a moment, but that impact over time and that sustainability. What's your perspective on forms of knowledge that have an impact, but also how that can contribute to changing the structures within which knowledge production transpires? Elena?
Thanks, James, and thanks to Foni and Yusuf for their excellent contributions to these important questions. So I think what I think of when I think about what knowledge has had an impact, I can find some very clear examples of what I would call negative impact, or impact that undermines people's well-being. So in fact, I'm going to be slightly disruptive, perhaps, and say that statistical knowledge, statistical information is often having a very, very negative and pernicious impact on people, and supporting the development of very illiberal and repressive responses to displacement. So statistics can very easily be repackaged to promote crisis narratives and support the development of control and surveillance, rather than supporting the needs and rights of people who've been displaced. So I think that there are many, many examples of knowledge being presented, one could say at times with the best of intentions, but with the very worst of impacts, which promote the development of extractive and abusive work conditions for refugees that in fact undermine people's rights and well-being. So I can find many examples of the negative impact. Then we can go on a much more micro level, and we can say, well, in fact, there are many, many examples of small encounters having a positive impact from the perspective of people themselves, not reaching policymakers, states or governments, but rather allowing people to do what they want to do, and providing limited resources at times that can help people overcome the structural barriers which have prevented them from being able to, for example, publish their own poetry. So what we did in Jordan, for example, is we had a space where people were writing under the facilitation of Yusuf, but people actually came with writing that they had already produced, and there was one participant who had written something, and the first thing that she said when she walked through the door is, "Can I read my poem?" And we said, "Oh, well, let's just wait, let's have coffee first." And she was keen to read her poem to the group, and she benefited from her own perspective in sharing what she had already produced. We didn't facilitate anything apart from having the space. So that barrier was lifted insofar as there was a venue to speak and to be heard. So this is something that she was already doing and that she wanted to share, and that was what was facilitated. There can be a positive impact indeed in being heard, not just in terms of the trauma narrative that is used, but rather people defining for themselves what they need and what they want. And I think that one key question that we have to think is, what kind of productive disruption is needed for structural inequalities to be overcome? So some kinds of structural inequalities are perpetuated by the academic infrastructure. And as you've mentioned, James, to reach tenure, we have to jump through certain hurdles. And some of those hurdles revolve around securing funding, publishing, etc. So what are some tangible means of overcoming this? Well, producing multilingual outputs, as Foni has suggested, publishing in open access journals and ensuring that materials are publicly available as widely as possible, but also recognizing that in fact there is mountains of research, as James, you've just said. Who's going to read our 8,000 word articles? And the fact that policy continues to develop in repressive and discriminatory manners indicates very clearly that there is political resistance rather than a lack of knowledge, which is leading to these particular responses. So perhaps what we need to do, whoever we are, is rather than continuing to ask people to regurgitate their trauma and retell their narratives to fill our boxes and our texts, is actually to focus more on the structural barriers that are preventing people from living their own meaningful lives and finding solutions to their own problems, and to confront the reality that the institutions that respond, whether in a humanitarian and inverted comma manner or through a control or surveillance manner, they have a vested interest in reproducing particular modes of response, irrespective of how many books and articles we write. But there are different forms of response, and destabilizing the status quo through disrupting particular narratives, through acknowledging local level responses across different displacement situations, something that Yusuf and I have been working on increasingly as well, rather than requiring Palestinians to write about Palestinians or South Sudanese to write about South Sudanese, to actually recognize the communication, the exchanges that exist across displacement situations, to go beyond narrating the self again and again and again. So are we ready to step back from documenting, narrating, storytelling, and actually focus more intently on how we can disrupt those structural inequalities, those barriers that prevent people from writing, responding, and finding their own solutions, not only finding them, but enacting them. So recognizing people as significant people to be heard and supported in overcoming those barriers. And that must entail productive disruption and disrupting those structural inequalities.
Yeah. Oh, Elena, no, I think that's such a critical point on which to transition to the really excellent questions we've been receiving in the Q&A box. This notion of disruption. There was an anonymous question that was from an anonymous viewer who raised the question about how we go about changing the infrastructure to disrupt these structural realities that lead to the outcomes that we discussed today. But I think your point is that it's not just about changing structures within the academy, that it's changing the very structures within which displacement is governed. These technologies that produce certain externalities are not externalities, they produce certain realities, that they're not just structures that condition the academic cycle, but that academic engagement needs to be mindful of the structures within which these relationships are constituted, and to be able to challenge those structures. Foni and Yusuf, John posed a particular question that I think Elena speaks to the point that you raised. So Elena, I'd invite your comments on it as well. John essentially poses a question on instances where the perspectives of persons of displacement, persons of forced displacement, have themselves been able to challenge prevailing policy paradigms and contribute to solutions. So to provide examples from the everyday of where the opportunity to realize what we discuss about the importance of bringing diverse perspectives into conversation. What is the potential when the voices that engage in policy discussion are not exclusively the voices of external academics, the so-called global experts, but are there moments, Foni, Yusuf, Elena, I'd invite you to comment on this as well, of where, and I'll use John's words from his questions, where refugee narratives have proven to be critical in policy dialogue. Where have we witnessed change? So perhaps first with that question, there's then a series of questions from Denise, Lena, Chiara, Juliet, and Dina, about best practices in changing the way we do research. But I'd like first to invite you to offer answers to John's questions about where refugee narratives have been proven to be able to do this. And then I'm going to turn to a broader set of questions about how within the academic community we can bring about the kinds of change we've been discussing. So Foni, you're unmuted. Over to you first, and then Yusuf and Elena, I'll invite you on this question of narrative. Foni, please.
Definitely. I think just reflecting back on my experience, as I mentioned, we do need willing organizations who would intentionally create spaces to build the capacity of refugees to also interact when it comes to policy or on changes that need to happen in order to shift policy discussions. In 2015, Women Refugee Commission, together with the UNHCR, conducted a series of global refugee youth consultation to really check in with them to see how can they disrupt or what are some of the needs that young people have when it comes to their needs particularly. And out of this, one of the things that was created was the Global Refugee Youth Council, which I was part of. And one of the things that ended up happening with the creation of the council, it automatically aligned with the drafting of the Global Compact for Refugees. And what this meant, because we had experienced that interaction and really build our capacity, we took this particular global document, translated it into multiple languages, and then also removed a lot of the jargons to make sure that it's very easy for our communities to understand. And we went back to our communities, had consultations with them, focus group discussion. What do you think about this? Is this really needed? Is this something that you would want to see included in the Global Compact? As a result of this, we went back to the global level, policy discussions, shared our findings on what the community felt was really important. And at the end of it, this resulted in some of the recommendations also being featured within this particular Global Compact document. This was a small win, but I think this is one of the process that we actually need to take even when it comes to sharing stories of success and how it can shift policy by first equipping refugees to be able to also really participate effectively 100%. And then this will later on contribute into the outcome of the processes that will happen. Bringing it close home for me personally, as a young woman, I ended up engaging in the South Sudanese peace talk. And because I had that support, then I was able to also kind of like drift and share my perspective on what needs to be included on the perspective of women. And through the support of the civil society, at least we got some of the recommendation into the deal that was signed. I think it really goes back to how we create the spaces, how we talk about the stories, and then giving the refugees themselves the right to say, in this particular occasion, I am not here to focus about my stories or retelling my stories or the success. It's really about also sharing the knowledge and the recommendation I have for this particular policy and how to move it forward. So that's what I think I could share on that.
Thank you very much, Foni. And I think I've put in the chat box the work that Rez Gardi and Mustafa Alio have done in our seat. And again, I think it speaks to this example that where there is collaboration around questions of meaningful refugee participation, that the potential for changing policy frameworks and assumptions, the impact on the Global Compact on refugees, and have another conversation about the significance of the Global Compact as an instrument. But the foregrounding of the recognition of the importance of meaningful refugee participation was very much a result of actors like yourself that advocated for that inclusion and moving that yardstick, however subtly, but moving it nonetheless. Yusuf, your perspective, please, on this question of where narratives have been able to influence policy environments. Yusuf, please.
I think, and of course, I can't talk sort of universally about this, but I can perhaps go back to Badawi camp. I think that what we have to acknowledge is that camps now are not nationally defined. They include different refugee groups, and these refugee groups. Also, when we have, for instance, I still remember that when people feel that, let's say, in Badawi camp, there are Iraqis, Kurds, Syrians, and Palestinians. Of course, Palestinians, the camp is a Palestinian camp. This is how it's viewed. And yet, of course, when Palestinians, Lebanese, Kurds, and Iraqis feel that they are not being assisted and that the focus, for instance, is on the Syrian. And this is really within this community how at times aid can be very disruptive, and also it engenders competitive narratives within that context. And I think that we need to be mindful of such discrepancies, and also of how at times we can be blind to the fact that these are all refugees living in very difficult circumstances, and their narratives are worthy of being heard, but also in egalitarian manner. And not to have this fixation on just one refugee group in a particular setting. This is something that, again, we have witnessed ourselves, and we've perhaps written about as well, this sort of hierarchy and how narratives also are hierarchical at times, whose voice is being recorded and whose voice is being relegated to the bottom as well. I don't know if this is, again, a direct answer to I believe, is it John's question, but at least this is my reflection on how I see narratives at times.
And I think it's a really important observation on sort of, there isn't a singularity of narratives, but often those narratives can be competing, and the privileging of one narrative over others can actually reinforce the kind of, pernicious paradigms that we're seeking to address. But Elena, this is also something that you've talked about quite a bit in your work and public commentary on this notion of narrative and change. I'd like to give you an opportunity to reflect upon this question as well. Elena, let me give you the floor, please.
Thank you, James. I'm going to be slightly contrarian again. And I'm certainly going to just start by highlighting the dangers of success stories and the dangers of best practice examples. So I think that best practice examples can often give a false positive, as it were. It might be best for some people, but it might actually be reproducing systems of marginalization, violence, and exclusion in others and for other people. Even if we're thinking about the Global Compact and the inclusion of certain people's voices, the fact that Palestinians are excluded from UNHCR, for example, indicates that there are hierarchies of inclusion and exclusion, and that there is a requirement for certain people to perform in a particular way. So I've written quite extensively on the dangers of the notion of the ideal refugee or the good refugee, and who is included and excluded in those processes, and how it does build and require competition between people in a way that undermines the broader framework of social justice that is something that is collective and communal and relational, and we need to be attentive to those processes. So I'd be attentive to those situations, but I'd also just like to remind us that we don't need to like or listen to all refugees. I don't like and listen to all citizens. So in fact, I think that there's a very important need for us to not like people is okay. We don't need to like everybody. We don't need to listen, and we don't need to expect that everybody is going to be a spokesperson for the good. We do research with people that we don't like. We do research with people who hold abhorrent views and perspectives. And yet we hopefully collectively still work for that notion of social justice and people's rights being upheld, irrespective of whether they are speaking in the right way or using the right terminology from our perspective. But it also challenges us to think about knowledge production and impact, in inverted commas, when we're not working with people who we like, and when we're not working with people whose voices we want to engage in in an egalitarian manner, but rather with a critical viewpoint. And again, it comes back to those uncomfortable questions, that sense of productive discomfort. What is it to actually start from the assumption that we are all unequally positioned, and that is the starting point? Structural inequalities exist. How can they be redressed in a way that is going to promote social justice writ large, whether or not we like the people who are participating in those conversations? or those who have stepped back and have excluded themselves for different reasons, or who are excluded by different systems. So that's, I think, just a quick reflection on the complexities that arise actually when refugees' narratives are not homogenous, but they're also not necessarily, it's not helpful necessarily to have a constant focus on the success stories, because it means that those people who don't meet those markers of success are excluded and are often subjected to different forms of both epistemic and physical and political violence.
No, thank you very much, Elena. And I think this speaks to, you know, deep questions that have run through the Q&A box. And I note with the 5 minutes that we have left in the webinar that we can't do justice to them all. But what I would ask, Susan, I'm going to offer the floor to you to offer your reflection on these themes for just a minute, and then Yusuf, Elena, and then Foni. I'm just going to ask you to offer us a concluding thought, maybe a lesson or a parting thought, perhaps. And Elena, I was going to frame it in terms of best practices, but given your last intervention, I won't use the term best practice. But perhaps in a takeaway, or in sort of what's the point that you want those in the audience to have emblazoned on their consciousness coming away from this, in terms of whether that's the art of the possible, whether it's the caveat, whether it's around questions of trust, whether it's questions of embracing this discomfort. I'll give you each an opportunity to say a last word with the time that we have left. I'm going to ask Rachel to put in the chat box the link to our next webinar, which is on the 19th of November, which continues this conversation and is specifically focused on the question of partnership. I'm also going to ask Rachel to put in the chat box the link to a special issue of Forced Migration Review that specifically looks at questions of knowledge, voice, and power, with a deadline for submissions in February for publication in July 2020. And there are the details up on the screen. But Susan, let me pass the floor to you for your observation, and then I will ask Yusuf, Elena, and Foni to offer words of conclusion. Susan, please.
Well, I want more time for our participants. This has been excellent. And I think also being able to challenge us as researchers and not to be constrained by our ethics boards that want us to anonymize and obliterate our participants, rather than having them being fully participant and as they decide they want to be. So thank you so much for all the great suggestions.
Thank you, Susan. Yusuf, a thought from you, and then Elena and Foni, please.
I think, once again, something that I've said before, that it is the plurality of knowledge that governs all of us. But we have to acknowledge that when knowledge is derived, it should be, in fact, acknowledged as such. So when we extract knowledge, we need to say that this knowledge belongs to those people who have produced it. And this is really, it's a very simple, ethical, egalitarian also understanding of how knowledge moves and how knowledge travels. This is really a very, I would say again, a very sort of a clear-cut, maybe conceptualization of how knowledge should be seen.
Thank you, Yusuf. Elena, please.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on Yusuf's notion of co-writing and co-seeing. So for me, some of the most insightful research encounters that I've had have pushed me to recognize the partiality of my own knowledge, the partiality of my own perspectives, and to recognize that working together with other colleagues can really push for the development of a more nuanced and complex understanding, and that can take different forms, whether it's combining voices in a piece of writing, as Yusuf and I have done in a piece where it's difficult to determine if it's his voice or my voice which is writing, or whether it's in my photography and Yusuf's responses to it, or whether it's the determination that literature plus social sciences equals complexity, and that it pushes for a completely different way of engaging with the encounters that we're working with and through. And that is fine, that we have partial knowledge, but we do not own the knowledge at all, that it is produced and co-produced, and that co-seeing, co-writing, and collaborative approaches to research can really push us to do things differently, and in a more egalitarian and nuanced manner. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elena. Phony, please, to you.
I think one takeaway that, one of two takeaways that would really be important for everyone to go away from the call with is, first of all, I think from the discussion, we've realized that we also need to recognize the power imbalances within the structures, within the privileges that even as researchers or people who are not even researchers that we have. I think it starts from them. Once you recognize that you have privilege and you have, there will always be power imbalances, then the next step will be to put in place accountability mechanisms. I think not just in terms of the organization, but also in the way that you interact with displaced scholars or displaced researchers. But I think that is really important. If you're talking about giving away power, it starts by giving them the dignity back to decide what they want to, how they want to study particular topics, how they want to write particular articles, and also agreeing with what Elena and Yusuf have said, really also acknowledging that the knowledge, if they have contributed, it still goes back to them. So I think that for me would be the key takeaway for this call.
No, that's essential. Thank you, Phony. Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, Elena. What an exceptional start to this series. As Rachel said in the chat box, these questions about trust and partnership are very much central, and questions of power are very much central to the series as a whole. So for those of you in the audience, please do consider joining us on the 19th of November as we consider this question of partnership and power within partnership more fully. I'm very much looking forward to Susan's moderating of that discussion and building on her experience on really seeing through many of these questions. I'd like to sincerely thank Phony, Yusuf, and Elena for their generosity of time and candor in their interventions. Thank you, Susan, and the team at the Refugee Research Network for joining us on this journey and in helping really frame the way that we can make the most of this opportunity to gather online. Thank you, Rachel, for your leadership in bringing this series to fruition. And thank you to Nadia, Richard, everyone in the LERRN team for making the technical aspects of this possible. But finally, and bang on the 90-minute mark, let me say thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. Wherever you are, stay safe and stay well. And I look forward to seeing many of you. Please join us at the next webinar as we continue this conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. Take good care.